Settle into the sleepy mind channel. Today we will explore the sunken pirate city of Port Royal beneath the sea. If you like videos like these, feel free to like and subscribe. More videos are posted weekly. In the late 17th century, Port Royal stood at the edge of Jamaica on one of the finest natural harbors in the Caribbean. It was a city shaped by sea trade, maritime travel, and constant movement across warm tropical waters. Ships arrived from Europe, from Spanish America, and from islands scattered across the Caribbean, carrying sugar, silver, timber, textiles, and news from faraway shores. Along the waterfront, masts rose in dense rows above crowded wharves, and the harbour often held vessels of many kinds at anchor at the same time. Merchants worked among storehouses filled with imported goods, sailors moved through narrow streets near the docks, and daily life was closely tied to the rhythm of wind, tide, and commerce. Port Royal grew quickly in both wealth and influence, and many people considered it one of the richest port cities in the New World. Yet what made the city remarkable was not only its prosperity, but the unusual landscape on which all of that prosperity rested. The city was built on a narrow sand spit called the Palisados, a long strip of land formed over time by currents, waves, and shifting deposits of sand. This setting created a protected harbour that encouraged trade and settlement, though the ground beneath the city was far less stable than it appeared. Much of the land consisted of loose sand filled with water, compressed under streets, warehouses, homes, and fortifications. To those living there, the city looked permanent, with brick buildings, busy markets, and solid waterfront structures. Yet beneath those streets, the earth held a hidden fragility. Modern geology would later explain how water-saturated sand can lose strength during severe shaking. But the people of Port Royal had no reason to think of the ground beneath them in those terms. They saw a successful port, a strategic harbour, and a city expanding with confidence. The streets were active from morning until night, and the city seemed to possess both energy and permanence. It is difficult to imagine, while looking at such a thriving place, that much of it would one day lie beneath the sea. Port Royal became known for trade, for privateering, and for the complicated world that existed where empire, commerce, and piracy sometimes overlapped. Goods moved through the harbour in constant flow. Fortunes were made through shipping and trade, and the city gained a reputation far beyond Jamaica. Privateers, some operating with official approval during periods of conflict, passed through the port and added to its reputation as a place tied to maritime risk and opportunity. Yet alongside those famous stories, much of life in Port Royal was ordinary and structured. Craftsmen worked their trades, dock workers loaded cargo, families lived in homes close to the sea, fishermen left the shore in small boats, food markets opened in the morning light, and merchants kept records of goods moving through the port. It was a working city as much as a legendary one, and daily routines unfolded beside stories of treasure and distant voyages. The setting itself helped shape the character of the city. Warm sea air moved through the streets. Sunlight reflected off harbour waters through much of the day. Ships entered and left according to wind and tide, and harbour life gave the city a constant sense of motion. Fortifications guarded the approaches from the sea, warehouses lined busy areas near the waterfront, and taverns and gathering places served sailors and merchants arriving from long journeys. Port Royal was not large compared with later cities, but it held enormous importance for the region. Its harbor connected trade routes across the Caribbean world, and its location helped make it prosperous. Many settlements rise slowly over generations, but Port Royal developed with unusual speed, gathering wealth and population in a relatively short time. That rapid growth added to its energy, and perhaps also to the confidence people placed in the city's future. There is something striking in imagining Port Royal at its height, before disaster entered its story. A visitor approaching by ship might first have seen the low sandy land reaching into blue water, then the clustered town rising beside the harbour, the fortifications, the piers, the forest of masts. Closer in, the sounds of commerce would have filled the air. Ropes pulled against wooden hulls, water tapped against pilings, cargo moved across planks toward warehouses, voices carried across the waterfront in many accents. For those living there, these scenes were ordinary, repeated day after day, and perhaps that is part of what makes the later destruction feel so extraordinary. The city did not appear doomed. It appeared busy, wealthy, and alive. Nothing in the ordinary scenes of trade and harbour life suggested how quickly the landscape beneath it could change. Yet even in a city that seemed secure, the natural setting held quiet forces not easily seen. Jamaica lies in a region shaped by tectonic movement, where stresses build slowly deep beneath the earth. Those forces can remain hidden for long periods, unnoticed in daily life, until released suddenly. In Port Royal, that unseen geological setting would shape one of the most dramatic urban disasters in history. The city's loose sandy foundation, combined with earthquake forces, created conditions that would prove catastrophic. What makes Port Royal unique is not simply that it suffered destruction, but that much of the city sank so rapidly and was preserved underwater in ways rarely seen elsewhere. Streets, structures, and everyday objects became part of a submerged archaeological record, leaving behind a remarkable frozen moment from the 17th century. That underwater preservation is part of what makes Port Royal so fascinating today. Many ancient cities survive only in ruins altered over centuries, but parts of Port Royal were suddenly transferred from a living city into an underwater environment where sediments protected what had been lost. Archaeologists later found evidence of streets, buildings, and objects preserved beneath the harbour floor, offering rare insight into urban life at the moment of disaster. This is one reason the city is often described as one of the most important underwater archaeological sites in the Western Hemisphere. It offers a meeting point between maritime history, geology, and archaeology. It tells a story not only about pirates and ports, but about unstable ground, natural forces, and the fragility of human settlements built in difficult environments. For now, though, the city still stands above water. The harbour remains full. Trade continues. Ships cross the blue entrance to the port. The streets remain crowded with merchants, labourers, sailors, and residents moving through ordinary routines. The sandy ground below remains unnoticed beneath stone walls and narrow lanes. In this first quiet view of Port Royal, it is possible to understand why the city drew so much attention in its own time. It was prosperous, strategically important, and deeply connected to the wider world through the sea. It was also built in a place where beauty and instability existed together. That tension between thriving city and fragile foundation lies at the heart of its story. As sunlight settles over the harbour, and ships rest at anchor in calm water, Port Royal appears secure in its wealth and activity. Yet beneath the streets lies the loose ground that will shape everything that follows. The harbour, the sand spit, and the hidden weakness below the city belong to the same story. To understand the fate of Port Royal, it helps first to understand the land beneath it, how this narrow ribbon of sand formed, how it held a thriving city for a time, and how the very ground that made the harbour possible would also make the disaster possible. That story begins beneath the streets themselves, in the fragile sandy foundation on which Port Royal rose beside the sea. Port Royal stood on a narrow strip of land whose unusual geography shaped the city long before it shaped the disaster that later made it famous. This thin reach of sand, called the Palisadoes, extended along the edge of Kingston Harbour and created one of the finest natural harbours in the Caribbean. Its position gave ships shelter from rougher open water, while allowing easy access to trade routes crossing the region. That protected harbour was one reason Port Royal developed so quickly into an important port. Yet the same land that made the harbour possible was not solid rock, but loose coastal sand formed through natural marine processes over long periods of time. Waves, tides, and currents gradually gathered sediments into this narrow barrier, shaping the landscape grain by grain. The city rose upon a landform created by the sea itself. The ground beneath Port Royal consisted largely of loose sand, holding large amounts of water. In ordinary conditions, such ground can seem firm and dependable, especially when compacted beneath roads and buildings, but its strength depends on a delicate balance between sand grains and the water moving among them. To people living in the city, the surface appeared stable enough for homes, warehouses, churches, and fortifications. Streets remained busy, buildings stood upright, and trade flourished across the waterfront. Little in daily life suggested that the very composition of the ground beneath those structures might one day become central to the city's fate. Yet the sandy foundation was always different from solid earth or bedrock. It supported the city, but it did so in a way that carried hidden limits. That loose foundation mattered because heavy structures pressed upon it from every direction. Brick buildings, storage houses, docks, seawalls, and crowded streets all rested on land formed from unconsolidated deposits. Under ordinary circumstances, the city functioned upon this foundation for years, but ground of this kind can become unstable under severe stress. Modern science would later explain that saturated sand may lose strength during violent shaking, but even without modern terms, it is possible to understand the basic vulnerability. A city built upon loose water-filled sand rests upon a far more fragile base than one built upon solid stone. This was not visible in the ordinary movement of daily life. It remained a hidden condition, unnoticed beneath prosperity and routine. Yet it was present from the beginning. The waters surrounding Port Royal helped shape this fragile landscape in many ways. The open Caribbean lay to one side, while the calmer harbour waters lay to the other, and together these marine forces influenced the sand spit over long stretches of time. Currents carried sediment. Storms could reshape shorelines. Tides worked continually along the edges of the land. The city's geography was therefore not fixed in the way inland landscapes often seem fixed, but part of a living coastal system always shaped by water. This same relationship with surrounding seas helped create the harbour that made Port Royal wealthy. Geography and prosperity were closely linked. The city owed much of its success to this unusual meeting of sea, sand, and sheltered water. There is a quiet irony in that relationship. The natural conditions that made Port Royal valuable also made it vulnerable. The harbour invited trade. The sand spit supported settlement. The coastal setting encouraged growth. Yet these same conditions meant the city stood upon ground that could respond unpredictably under powerful disturbance. What seemed like strength held weakness within it. This is one reason Port Royal has long fascinated both historians and geologists. Its destruction was not caused by a single force alone, but by the meeting of earthquake energy with a landscape already prone to instability. The foundations of the disaster were present long before the disaster itself. To imagine Port Royal during its height is to picture a thriving city resting above this hidden fragility without awareness of it. Merchants counted cargo in waterfront buildings. Sailors moved through narrow lanes near the docks. Ships entered the harbour under steady winds. Cannon watched the approaches from the sea. Ordinary life continued with confidence in the city's prosperity. Yet beneath those ordinary scenes lay loose sand, water, and pressure held in delicate balance. The city flourished on a foundation few people would have questioned. In many ways, this contrast gives Port Royal much of its enduring power as a story. Great wealth above, hidden vulnerability below. The instability of sandy ground under pressure would later become central to understanding what happened in the year 1692. When severe shaking came, the very qualities that defined the land would help determine the scale of destruction. The sand that had supported streets and buildings could no longer behave in the same way. Ground itself would begin to fail. But before that moment arrived, there were hints, small disturbances, and uneasy signs that all was not entirely still beneath the city. Some noticed tremors, some noticed shifting. Such signs were poorly understood, easy to dismiss in a busy port alive with commerce. Yet they belonged to the unfolding story, early warnings before the great rupture to come. Port Royal's rise to wealth began with its position in the Caribbean, but geography alone did not make the city prosperous. Wealth grew through movement, exchange, and the constant circulation of goods through one of the busiest harbors in the region. Ships arrived carrying products from Europe, the Americas, and neighboring islands, while departing vessels carried sugar, timber, hides, rum, and other valuable cargoes outward across the Atlantic world. The harbor became a meeting place for trade routes connecting distant markets, and this steady movement of goods helped transform a small settlement into a major commercial center. Prosperity did not appear all at once, but gathered through repeated transactions, voyages, and maritime enterprise. Cargo unloaded at the waterfront passed into warehouses, into markets, into ships bound elsewhere, and wealth accumulated through this constant exchange. The city's fortune was tied to the sea, and every arriving vessel could add to its growing importance. Trade in Port Royal involved far more than the loading and unloading of goods. Commerce created systems of labor, services, and financial activity that spread throughout the city. Merchants kept records of shipments and prices. Storehouses held imported wares awaiting resale. Ship captains sought supplies, repairs, and crews before returning to sea. Artisans found work supporting maritime life through carpentry, sail-making, rope work, and other skilled trades. Markets supplied food and everyday necessities to residents and visiting sailors alike. Wealth in a port city often extends beyond coins and cargo into the many activities supported by commerce, and Port Royal developed this broader prosperity. As trade increased, businesses multiplied, and the city became known not only as a harbour, but as a place where fortunes could be built. Some of Port Royal's prosperity came through its role in wider imperial competition, where trade, conflict, and maritime opportunity often overlapped. Goods moved through the city because its harbour served important regional networks, and its strategic location encouraged merchants and authorities alike to invest in its growth. Ships entering the harbour brought more than cargo. They brought information, new commercial links, and opportunities for exchange that could widen the city's reach. Prosperity often grows where routes converge, and Port Royal stood at such a meeting point. It connected islands, continents, and economies through the movement of people and goods. That constant circulation gave the city an energy tied to opportunity. For many arriving there, Port Royal represented a place where wealth might be found more readily than elsewhere. As prosperity increased, the city itself expanded to support it. More warehouses were built near the waterfront. Commercial districts grew denser. Services supporting trade became more established. Streets filled with activity tied directly or indirectly to maritime commerce. Economic growth shaped the physical form of the city as much as its reputation. Wealth does not remain abstract for long. It appears in buildings, infrastructure, trade facilities, and the rhythm of daily life. In Port Royal, prosperity could be seen in the scale of goods passing through the harbour, in the crowded docks, and in the growing complexity of the city's commercial life. Success reinforced further success, drawing more trade, more residents, and greater investment. This prosperity also shaped the city's reputation far beyond Jamaica. Port Royal became known across the Caribbean as a place of unusual wealth and activity. Such reputations often attract even more movement, and the city drew merchants, sailors, investors, labourers, and fortune seekers in growing numbers. A successful port tends to become a magnet, and Port Royal held that role in its era. The city's name carried associations with commerce, opportunity, and abundance. For those arriving by sea, the harbour could seem a gateway into a thriving world of exchange. For those already living there, prosperity may have appeared not as something extraordinary, but simply the ordinary condition of the city. Yet wealth in Port Royal was never static. It depended on motion. Ships had to keep coming. Cargo had to keep moving. Markets had to remain active. Prosperity in a port city lives through circulation rather than stillness. This constant movement gave Port Royal much of its character. The harbour was rarely quiet. New arrivals altered the rhythm of the docks each day. Prices changed with shipments. News from distant places could influence trade almost as quickly as goods themselves. Commerce brought not only riches, but a sense of a city tied to a much larger world. Port Royal did not feel isolated at the edge of an island. It felt connected outward through sea routes extending in many directions. The wealth flowing through the city also supported forms of leisure and social life that would later contribute to its famous reputation. Prosperity often creates spaces for entertainment, hospitality, and display, and Port Royal was known for such activity. Yet even beneath that reputation, the deeper foundation of the city's wealth remained trade itself. Ships, cargo, and exchange formed the engine of prosperity. Without the harbor and the constant maritime movement through it, the city could not have become what it was. This is why the rise of wealth belongs so closely to the geography explored before it. The harbor made trade possible. Trade created prosperity. Prosperity transformed the city. There is something striking in how quickly this growth occurred. Many old cities accumulate importance over centuries, but Port Royal's rise was unusually rapid. That speed gave it energy, but perhaps also a sense of confidence that prosperity would continue without limit. Success can make a city appear secure, even where hidden vulnerability remains beneath it. As trade flourished and wealth accumulated, little in daily life suggested how suddenly fortune could be interrupted. The bustling harbour, the crowded warehouses, the profitable exchanges all carried a sense of momentum. Port Royal seemed to be rising, not approaching catastrophe. Yet prosperity can shape more than economics. It can shape behaviour, expectations, and reputation. In Port Royal, wealth encouraged a social world that became nearly as famous as its commerce. Taverns, gathering places, and the lively culture of a maritime city grew alongside trade itself. The harbour brought goods, but it also brought people with stories, ambitions, and risks. In a city where wealth moved quickly, life often moved quickly as well. This social energy would become part of Port Royal's legend and part of what distinguished it from many other ports of its age. As the city prospered, the streets near the harbour grew more crowded, trade more constant, and reputation more expansive. Port Royal stood not merely as a settlement beside a harbour, but as a flourishing centre shaped by wealth moving through sea routes that connected much of the Caribbean world. Goods passed through the docks, fortunes rose, commerce sustained daily life. Yet alongside merchants and trade, there were others drawn by opportunity on more uncertain terms, figures tied to privateering and piracy, whose presence would deepen the city's unusual character. Their story grew alongside this prosperity, and from the same harbour where wealth arrived under sail. Port Royal's growing wealth drew many kinds of people to its harbour, and among them were privateers and seafarers whose activities helped shape the city's unusual reputation. In the 17th century, the boundary between lawful maritime warfare and piracy was not always clear in the way it may seem today. During periods of conflict, privateers sailed with official commissions, allowing them to seize enemy vessels, and some brought captured goods into ports such as Port Royal. This connection between commerce and privateering contributed to the city's identity as a place where trade and risk often stood close together. Ships entering the harbour did not carry only ordinary cargo. Some arrived with prize goods taken at sea, and those goods could move into the same markets and warehouses that supported more conventional trade. In this way, piracy, privateering, and commerce sometimes overlapped in ways that added both wealth and notoriety to the port. Port Royal became known in part because it occupied this complicated maritime world. The presence of privateers helped give the city a reputation larger than its physical size. Stories of famous sea captains passed through taverns and waterfront streets. News of raids, captured vessels, and fortunes won at sea circulated beside ordinary trade news. Such stories helped create an image of Port Royal as a harbour where bold ventures began or ended. Yet the city's relationship with these figures was rooted not simply in legend, but in practical realities of maritime life and imperial rivalry. Privateers often needed places to resupply, repair ships, recruit crews, and exchange captured goods. Ports with strong harbors and active markets naturally served these needs. Port Royal's prosperity and location made it well suited to this role. The city became linked to a wider world of naval conflict and private maritime enterprise. Stolen goods and prize cargoes added another layer to the city's economy. Goods taken at sea could enter markets, be traded, sold, or redistributed, and this contributed to the sense that legal and illegal commerce sometimes met in the same harbor. Port Royal did not prosper because of piracy alone, far from it, but these activities formed part of the mixture that gave the city its distinctive character. Merchants, sailors, laborers, and officials all shared the city with people drawn by maritime risk and sudden fortune. This helped create a port unlike quieter commercial settlements whose economies rested on trade alone. Port Royal seemed to stand at a crossroads where lawful commerce, imperial conflict, and seafaring opportunism sometimes touched. This world of privateering also reflected the realities of the Caribbean in that era. Competition among empires shaped shipping routes, military strategy, and trade itself. Maritime conflict was woven into regional life, and ports often felt those pressures directly. Port Royal's harbour offered both commercial opportunity and strategic usefulness, which made it attractive in several ways at once. Ships associated with privateering could be part of that broader system rather than existing entirely outside it. This is important because the city's reputation has often leaned so heavily toward pirate legend that the larger historical setting can be overlooked. The reality was more layered. Port Royal was a serious port city whose ties to privateering formed one part of a much wider maritime economy. Yet legends endure for a reason, and Port Royal inspired many. Tales of treasure, sea raids, and notorious captains became attached to the city early in its history. Harbour towns often generate stories, but few gathered such vivid ones as Port Royal. The constant arrival of ships meant stories arrived with them. One crew might bring rumour of distant conflict. Another might speak of storms survived or cargo seized. These tales moved through taverns and dockside gathering places, adding colour to the life of the city. Reputation grows not only from facts, but from the stories people repeat, and Port Royal became famous through both. Even so, daily life in the city continued far beyond these famous tales. Most people in Port Royal were not pirates. Most were engaged in ordinary work tied to the harbour and the city's growing economy. Dock labourers moved cargo, merchants managed trade, craftsmen supported maritime activity, families built lives in the streets near the waterfront. This ordinary life remained the larger foundation of the city, even while the presence of privateers contributed to its image. That balance matters. It keeps Port Royal grounded as a real place, rather than a legend alone. The city's unusual character came from the meeting of ordinary urban life with extraordinary maritime reputation. The association with piracy also brought a sense of risk and unpredictability that suited a fast-growing port. Fortunes could rise suddenly, goods might arrive unexpectedly, news from the sea could alter opportunities overnight. In such an atmosphere, the city may have seemed dynamic in ways calmer settlements did not. Opportunity carried uncertainty, wealth moved quickly, maritime life encouraged a certain boldness. These qualities became part of Port Royal's identity. They did not define all of it, but they helped distinguish the city from other ports of the Caribbean. Prosperity and privateering together also supported the social culture for which Port Royal became famous. Where sailors gathered, where money circulated, and where stories of fortune traveled freely, social life often grows lively. Taverns, inns, and gathering places flourished in such settings. The city developed a reputation for energy and excess that later writers often emphasized. While some descriptions may have been exaggerated, they reflected the impression Port Royal made upon many observers. Wealth, maritime traffic, and the presence of seafaring adventurers all contributed to a city people regarded as unusually active and unruly. There is another reason this chapter of Port Royal matters. The city's pirate reputation often captures imagination first, drawing attention before deeper parts of the story unfold. Yet beneath the legends lies something more interesting. This famous harbour of privateers and merchants was also a dense urban settlement built on fragile ground. Even amid stories of treasure and sea raids, the quiet geological vulnerability beneath the city remained unchanged. Prosperity and notoriety could not alter the nature of the land beneath the streets. The harbour remained busy. The city remained crowded. The sandy foundation remained hidden below it all. As trade continued and privateers moved through the port, social life in Port Royal grew ever more active. Taverns filled, gathering places thrived, and wealth helped support a lively urban world that became almost as famous as the harbour itself. To understand the city at its height, it is not enough to see ships and commerce alone. One must also see the crowded social life that prosperity made possible, the rhythms of leisure and excess that became woven into the reputation of Port Royal. That wider social world rises next from the same bustling streets near the sea. Prosperity shaped more than trade in Port Royal. It shaped the social life of the city, giving rise to a lively urban culture that became one of the most remarked upon features of the port. Where wealth circulated quickly and ships arrived in constant succession, gathering places naturally flourished. Taverns stood near the waterfront, where sailors, merchants, labourers, and travellers met after long days tied to the harbour. Inns received visitors arriving by sea. Public houses served food and drink to a population always in motion. These places were not separate from the life of the port, but part of its ordinary rhythm. Business deals might begin in warehouses and continue in taverns. News from arriving ships often spread first through conversation in crowded rooms. Social life and commercial life often moved together. Port Royal gained a reputation for abundance and excess, though behind that reputation lay the simpler reality of a prosperous port supporting many forms of leisure. In active maritime cities, long voyages, sudden wealth, and irregular schedules often encourage intense social activity when ships reach harbour. Port Royal followed that pattern, though observers often believed it exceeded it. Music, conversation, food, gambling, and celebration were all said to be common parts of urban life there. Some descriptions were likely coloured by legend, yet even allowing for exaggeration, the city seems to have been known for an unusually active social atmosphere. Prosperity supported such a world. Where money moves, entertainment often follows. In Port Royal, social energy reflected economic energy, Taverns in particular played an important role in port cities of the era. They were not merely places of recreation, but centers where information circulated. Sailors exchanged news of routes and storms. Merchants heard reports affecting trade. Captains sought crews. Agreements could be discussed over food and drink as readily as informal offices. In this sense, social spaces also served practical functions. Port Royal's reputation for lively taverns was therefore tied not only to leisure, but to the working life of the harbour itself. The city's famous social world grew from maritime reality as much as from indulgence. The population of Port Royal added to this atmosphere. Merchants, sailors, soldiers, dock workers, craftsmen, and travellers from many places moved through the city, bringing varied customs, languages, and habits. Ports often gather diversity through movement, and such variety can make urban life especially vibrant. New arrivals constantly altered the social texture of the city. A ship entering harbour did not bring cargo alone. It brought people carrying stories, news, tastes, and practices from distant places. This gave the city a sense of connection to a wider world. Social life reflected that openness. Port Royal was not inward-looking. It faced outward through the sea. Wealth also shaped the city's physical spaces of leisure. Gathering places multiplied because there was demand for them. Busy streets near the waterfront likely held shops, inns, food sellers, and places of amusement close beside the commercial life of the port. This closeness between trade and leisure was characteristic of many maritime cities, though Port Royal became particularly famous for it. Work and recreation stood close together. The day might begin with loading cargo and end in conversation beside lantern light near the harbour. Such rhythms gave the city a distinctive pulse. It was not simply a place where goods moved, but where urban life felt animated by that movement. The reputation for excess that later clung to Port Royal often overshadowed another truth, that lively social life can also signal confidence and prosperity. People gather where they feel a city is thriving. They spend, celebrate, and linger where opportunity seems plentiful. In that sense, the city's famous social energy reflected the height of its success. The harbour was active, trade was strong, wealth circulated, social life mirrored those conditions. This is part of why Port Royal at its height has seemed so vivid in historical memory. It was not remembered as quiet or austere, but as intensely alive. Yet alongside stories of celebration, ordinary social life also mattered. Families shared meals, neighbours visited, residents formed communities within the busy port. Social life includes not only public entertainment, but everyday human connection. In a city often remembered for taverns and privateers, these quieter forms of social life can be easy to overlook, yet they gave the city depth beyond legend. Port Royal was a lived place where people worked, gathered, raised families, and built routines within the restless energy of the harbour. This ordinary social fabric gave the city substance beneath its famous reputation. Prosperity can sometimes create an illusion of permanence. A city full of activity and wealth may seem secure precisely because life feels abundant. In Port Royal, the crowded social world, the active streets, the busy waterfront, all reinforce the impression of a thriving place with a confident future. Little in these scenes suggested vulnerability. The same sandy ground discussed earlier lay beneath taverns, as surely as beneath warehouses and fortifications, yet social life moved above it with little thought to geology. This contrast remains striking. One of the liveliest ports in the Caribbean stood upon hidden fragility. The city's social reputation would later feed into moral interpretations of its destruction, as some later observers tried to treat catastrophe as judgment upon excess. Such interpretations tell more about later attitudes than about geology. Earthquakes do not choose cities for their reputations, yet those old interpretations reveal how famous Port Royal's social life had become. People remembered the city not only for trade and piracy, but for the intensity of life in its streets. That memory became part of its legend. Still, beneath legend stood a real city, shaped by commerce, community, and everyday human routines. As social life flourished in taverns, homes, markets, and waterfront gathering places, the physical city continued growing denser. Buildings stood close along narrow streets. Warehouses, homes, and public structures crowded valuable ground near the harbour. Urban form itself reflected the prosperity and activity already explored. To understand the life of Port Royal more fully, it now helps to look closely at that dense cityscape, at how streets were arranged, how buildings stood together, and how the physical structure of the city both supported daily life and carried its own hidden vulnerability. Port Royal's prosperity and social energy took physical form in the layout of the city itself. Buildings stood close together along narrow streets shaped by the demands of trade, limited space, and the pressure of growth on a narrow strip of land. Valuable ground near the harbour encouraged dense construction, and much of the city developed in compact patterns suited to a busy port where movement of people and goods remained constant. Streets connected docks, markets, storehouses, and residential areas in a layout shaped less by broad open planning than by practical use. In such places, urban structure often grows from necessity. Cargo had to move efficiently. People had to live near work tied to the harbour. Services needed to cluster where traffic was greatest. Port Royal's form reflected these realities. Buildings in the city served many purposes. There were homes for residents, shops for trade, warehouses for storage, public structures, and fortifications tied to the harbour's defence. Near the waterfront, commercial buildings likely stood close to piers where goods could move quickly between ship and shore. Storage houses held valuable cargo awaiting shipment or sale. Shops supported the needs of residents and visiting sailors. Homes stood among this commercial life rather than far removed from it. In a compact port city, daily life and trade often existed side by side. The built environment reflected a city where commerce shaped nearly every district. Construction methods responded in part to local conditions and available materials. Some structures were of brick or masonry, others of timber, and many were built in ways considered practical for a busy colonial port. Buildings could be substantial, yet the dense urban arrangement meant structures often stood closely packed. This closeness gave the city efficiency and vitality, but also increased vulnerability. Where buildings stand near one another, damage in one place can affect surrounding structures more quickly. Dense urban form often carries both strength and risk. Port Royal's crowded layout contributed to its lively character, yet in time it would also matter during destruction. Narrow streets help define movement through the city. One can imagine lanes near the waterfront busy with carts, labourers, merchants, and sailors moving between ships and markets. Streets serve not only circulation, but commerce itself. with goods passing through them and social life unfolding along them. In thriving ports, streets often function almost as extensions of the harbour, carrying the energy of maritime trade inland. Port Royal likely possessed that quality. The city's urban structure was not separate from harbour life, but deeply tied to it. Streets, piers and buildings formed a single system supporting exchange. The density of Port Royal reflected the pressure of prosperity upon limited land. Because the city occupied a narrow sandspit, expansion faced physical constraints. This often encourages building close together and making intensive use of available space. As trade increased and population grew, the city became more concentrated. Warehouses rose where cargo needed storage. Homes clustered where residents sought proximity to work. Taverns and gathering places stood where traffic passed. Urban density was therefore a sign of success, but also of the limits imposed by geography. The city prospered within a narrow physical frame. This concentration also placed significant weight upon the sandy foundation beneath the city. Every building, warehouse wall, and crowded street rested on the loose, water-filled ground explored earlier. While residents may have thought little about this in daily life, the relationship between dense construction and unstable ground would later prove significant. Heavy structures on fragile foundations can carry hidden risk. Yet at the height of prosperity, the dense cityscape likely appeared simply as evidence of flourishing urban life. Crowded streets suggested vitality. Packed districts suggested success. Vulnerability remained unseen beneath those signs. Ports are often places of continual sound and motion, and the structure of Port Royal likely amplified that sense. Along narrow streets, voices would have carried between buildings. Activity from docks may have reached deep into the city. The movement of cargo, carts, and people through compact spaces gave the urban environment a constant pulse. This physical closeness may also have strengthened the city's social world, bringing people into frequent contact in markets, lanes, and waterfront districts. Urban form influences social life as much as commerce. Port Royal's crowded structure helped shape both. The arrangement of buildings also supported the city's dependence on trade. Storage near docks reduced movement of cargo. Streets linked commercial functions efficiently. Residential life remained tied to maritime activity because people lived close to the harbour economy sustaining them. In this sense, the city's structure was practical, shaped by economic purpose. It helped Port Royal function as a major port. Yet practical arrangements built for prosperity do not always account for rare catastrophe. Cities often reveal hidden weaknesses only when extraordinary forces test them. There is something poignant in imagining these streets before the earthquake, buildings standing close beneath tropical light, busy lanes filled with commerce, storehouses holding goods from distant shores, homes occupied in ordinary routine, all of it appearing durable and established. Yet the dense layout that made the city feel substantial would later intensify the scale of collapse when the ground began to fail. Structures crowded together on unstable land created conditions where destruction could spread quickly. What had seemed signs of urban strength could become elements of vulnerability. Port Royal's physical structure therefore formed more than scenery for its history. It was part of the forces shaping both its success and its fate. The crowded streets supported trade. The buildings expressed prosperity. The dense layout reflected growth upon limited land, yet all rested upon the same fragile sandy foundation. To understand the city as a living place, one must see not only its streets and buildings, but the daily routines moving through them. Merchants opening shops, sailors crossing lanes, laborers at the docks, families living within this compact harbor city. From the structure of the city itself, attention now turns to the ordinary patterns of life unfolding within it each day. Each day in Port Royal began with the harbor already shaping the life of the city. Ships resting at anchor, boats moving through sheltered water, and activity beginning along the waterfront formed part of the ordinary rhythm that guided daily routines. For many residents, life was tied directly to the port. Merchants opened storehouses and counted incoming goods. Dock workers prepared to move cargo from vessels to shore. Sailors arriving from sea sought supplies, repairs, or rest before the next voyage. Fishermen worked local waters. Craftsmen carried out trade supporting ships and urban life alike. The city's daily routines grew from this maritime setting, and much of what happened in Port Royal each day began with the harbour. The population of the city included people from many walks of life, each contributing to the workings of a busy port. Merchants handled trade. Labourers moved goods. Carpenters, sailmakers, and smiths supported maritime needs. Shopkeepers supplied daily necessities. Soldiers served in the harbour defences. Families maintained homes within the crowded streets near the waterfront. A port city depends on countless ordinary tasks repeated day after day, and Port Royal was sustained through such routines. Though stories of treasure and privateers often capture imagination, much of the city's reality lay in ordinary work. It was through these daily patterns that prosperity was maintained. The movement of ships shaped time itself in such a place. Arrivals could alter the rhythm of a day. A newly arrived vessel might bring urgent unloading, fresh trade opportunities, or news affecting merchants across the port. Departures required preparation and provisioning. Tides and winds influenced schedules. Harbour activity did not sit apart from daily life, but often determined its pace. In this sense, Port Royal operated in close partnership with maritime movement. The city responded continually to the sea. Daily routines were not fixed in the same way they might be in inland towns. They moved with commerce. Markets likely formed another centre of everyday life. Food, imported goods, practical supplies, and materials needed for work would have passed through local commerce beyond large-scale shipping. Residents gathered not only in grand centres of trade, but in ordinary places where goods were bought, sold, and exchanged. Such spaces helped bind the social and economic life of the city together. Daily life in a thriving port depends not only on great shipments crossing oceans, but on the ordinary exchanges that sustain residents from morning until evening. Port Royal's prosperity rested partly on these humble transactions repeated without fanfare. Homes in the city stood close to this commercial energy. For many residents, there was little separation between work and home, because maritime activity shaped both. A family living near the waterfront might hear harbour sounds daily. Trade routes influencing distant markets might affect household fortunes. Visitors from far places might be common sights in nearby streets. In this way, even private domestic life was touched by the wider world entering through the harbour. Port Royal's connection to global movement was not abstract. It reached into ordinary routines. The city may have seemed constantly active, yet routine gives even busy places a kind of steadiness. People knew their work. Ships followed familiar processes of arrival and departure. Streets carried repeated patterns of movement. Familiarity often creates confidence, and in Port Royal, daily repetition may have reinforced the sense of a thriving city built to endure. Ordinary routine can make extraordinary risk seem unimaginable. This is often true in places later struck by sudden disaster. Life feels too established to vanish quickly. Port Royal carried that sense of established activity. Because the city operated through continual maritime exchange, there was likely little true stillness. Even when one ship departed, another approached. Goods moved through warehouses in ongoing circulation. Labor followed the needs of trade. New faces appeared as others left. The city lived in motion. This constant activity gave Port Royal energy, but also meant much of life depended on systems of movement that seemed permanent because they repeated so reliably. Prosperity often feels secure when its rhythms become familiar. Yet beneath those familiar routines, the same fragile ground remained unchanged. Daily life also carried pleasures shaped by the harbour city setting. Meals shared after work, conversation in streets or gathering places, visits among neighbours, and the simple routines of ordinary living all formed part of the city's human texture. Great historical events often draw attention away from such details, yet they are what make a city real. Port Royal was not merely a port of wealth and piracy, but a place where ordinary people woke, worked, rested, and expected tomorrow to resemble today. That expectation of continuity is part of what gives later catastrophe its force. There may also have been small disturbances within this ordinary life that passed with little notice. Minor tremors in a seismically active region, subtle shifts in structures, or occasional signs of unsettled ground may not have seemed extraordinary in themselves. In busy cities, such things can be absorbed into routine rather than treated as warnings. People living within daily demands rarely interpret every irregularity as a sign of coming disaster. This too belongs to the realism of the story. Hidden vulnerability often exists quietly beside ordinary life without altering it, until some greater force brings it suddenly into view. As day followed day, ships entered the harbour, markets remained active, labour sustained prosperity, and residents moved through routines shaped by trade and the sea. Port Royal functioned with the confidence of a successful city alive through constant movement. Yet beneath those ordinary days there were faint signs that all was not entirely still. Small disturbances and uneasy hints would begin to matter, though at first they seemed easy to overlook within so active a place. Those early warning signs now begin to rise within the story of the city. Port Royal's daily life depended upon systems built to support the constant movement of trade, and much of the city's prosperity rested on the infrastructure surrounding its harbour. Docks and piers extended the life of the city into the water itself, creating the points where ships, cargo, and commerce met. Vessels arriving in the harbour depended upon these waterfront structures for loading, unloading, repairs, and resupply. Goods moving across the Caribbean world passed through these spaces in an almost continuous rhythm. Timber piers, wharves, mooring points, and working waterfronts formed the practical foundation of maritime trade. Without them, the harbour would have been sheltered water alone. With them, it became a commercial engine. Port Royal's success was inseparable from these structures built along the edge of the sea. The docks were likely among the busiest places in the city. Cargo moved from ship holds onto shore, from warehouses back to vessels, and between merchants conducting business tied to arriving fleets. Barrels, crates, ropes, tools, and provisions all belonged to the ordinary machinery of trade. The waterfront was a place of labor as much as exchange. Workers loaded and unloaded goods. Ship crews prepared for departures. Supplies needed for long voyages were gathered and transferred. Repairs might be carried out near the harbor where vessels could be serviced. The port functioned through these repeated practical tasks, and its infrastructure made such movement possible. Storage facilities formed another essential part of this system. Warehouses held goods arriving from distant regions and protected cargo before redistribution. Sugar, rum, timber, textiles, food supplies, and many other materials likely passed through such spaces. Storage was not a secondary feature of trade, but central to it, because goods often paused in the city before continuing onward. Port Royal's wealth depended partly on serving as such a point of exchange. Goods came in, remained for a time, then moved outward again. Warehouses made this circulation possible. Their presence reflected both the scale of commerce and the complexity of the port's economic life. Roads and narrow streets linked the waterfront to the rest of the city and allowed these systems to function together. Cargo did not remain at the docks. It moved inland through urban spaces shaped for trade. Streets connected storehouses, markets, workshops, and residential districts in a network supporting movement. In a port city, roads are often extensions of the harbour itself, carrying inland the activity beginning at the water's edge. Port Royal likely possessed that quality in full. Streets did not merely serve residents moving through daily life. They supported the movement of goods on which prosperity depended. Infrastructure often reveals what a city values most, and in Port Royal much seems to have been organised around exchange and mobility. Harbour facilities supported shipping, storage supported commerce, roads supported circulation, fortifications supported security for the port. Together, these systems created a city able to function as a major maritime centre. Prosperity was not simply a result of favourable geography. It also depended on structures built to make use of that geography. The harbour may have invited trade, but infrastructure allowed trade to flourish at scale. This practical framework also supported constant movement that could make the city feel vigorous and secure. Ships arrived and found facilities ready to receive them. Goods could be processed through the city efficiently. Labour was organised around these systems. Repetition built confidence. A thriving port often seems durable because its workings appear so well established. In Port Royal, infrastructure likely contributed to that sense of permanence. The city did not seem temporary or improvised. It seemed functioning, prosperous, and rooted in systems supporting growth. Yet these structures, like everything else in the city, rested on the same narrow, sandy foundation explored earlier. Docks stood along shifting coastal margins. Warehouses rose on loose ground. Roads crossed land formed by sediments laid down through marine processes. The practical systems supporting prosperity shared the same hidden vulnerability as homes and taverns. This fact remained largely invisible in ordinary life. Strong infrastructure can create an impression of stability, yet structures remain subject to the conditions beneath them. In Port Royal, even the city's most practical strength stood upon fragile ground. There is something revealing in considering how much the city depended on uninterrupted movement. Trade required functioning docks. Storage required secure buildings. Roads had to remain passable. Harbour activity depended on these systems working together. Such dependence can be a strength in ordinary times, though it can also create fragility when disruption comes. A city organized around movement can be profoundly affected when that movement stops suddenly. Though no one in Port Royal could have known it, much of this carefully functioning infrastructure would one day face such a test. Still, during the city's prosperous years, these structures represented success. Busy piers, full warehouses, and active roads all testified to growth. They made visible the commercial vitality already shaping Port Royal's reputation. Through them, the harbour became more than a natural feature. It became a working port of remarkable energy. One can imagine sunlight along crowded wharves, ships resting in sheltered water, workers moving cargo through narrow streets, and warehouses standing full near the waterfront. Such scenes help explain why the city appeared so secure at its height. Yet even amid this confidence, there were faint signs in the natural world not fully understood. Minor tremors had been felt. Some structures may have shifted slightly. The ground beneath the city was not as motionless as it seemed. In a place so occupied with trade and daily activity, such hints could be overlooked or dismissed as ordinary irregularities. But they belonged to a deeper story already forming beneath the busy port. While docks remained crowded and warehouses full, the first quiet warnings were beginning to gather beneath Port Royal. Before the destruction of Port Royal, there were signs, though faint and poorly understood, that the ground beneath the city was not entirely still. In a place built upon loose water-filled sand in a seismically active region, small disturbances may have occurred from time to time without provoking great concern. Minor tremors were reported before the great earthquake, though such movements may have seemed little more than passing irregularities to those living through them. In many regions where earthquakes occur, small shocks can be felt without leading people to expect catastrophe. They may rattle objects, stir brief unease, then pass. In a busy port alive with commerce, such moments could easily be absorbed into ordinary experience. Yet in hindsight, they take on another meaning. What seemed minor may have belonged to a much larger process gathering beneath the city. The unstable ground itself may also have offered subtle hints of weakness. A settlement built on loose, saturated sand can show small signs long before dramatic failure. Slight settling of structures, uneven surfaces, or shifts too modest to seem alarming might occur without attracting much notice. In a crowded working city, where repairs and imperfections were ordinary parts of urban life, such signs would not necessarily have been interpreted as warnings. A leaning wall might invite maintenance rather than fear. A minor shift in a structure might seem no more than a practical problem. Yet beneath such ordinary interpretations lay the possibility that the land itself carried deeper instability than people realized. Some structures may have shown evidence of movement difficult to explain at the time. Buildings resting on sandy ground can respond to slow settling in subtle ways. Floors may move out of level, masonry may crack, surfaces may shift almost too gradually to provoke alarm. Even if such things occurred in Port Royal, They would have existed within a city where growth, heavy use, and coastal conditions already created constant demands for upkeep. It is easy to imagine how signs that later seem significant could have passed almost unnoticed amid ordinary concerns. People rarely see warning clearly before disaster. Often warning becomes visible only afterward. Life in Port Royal continued despite whatever signs may have appeared, because little likely suggested that a great rupture was near. The harbour remained active. Trade continued. Streets remained crowded. Ships entered and departed as before. Daily routines possess a kind of persuasive power. When ordinary life continues, it encourages belief that tomorrow will resemble today. This is one reason hidden danger can remain hidden. Familiar activity softens concern. Prosperity can make disruption seem unlikely. In Port Royal, confidence in the city and the continuity of daily life likely outweighed unease caused by occasional disturbances. There is also the simple fact that 17th century people did not possess modern geological understanding through which such signs might be interpreted. Today, small tremors near unstable ground may raise concern among those who study seismic risk. In Port Royal, those conceptual tools did not exist. Earth movements could be experienced, but their deeper meaning remained obscure. The people of the city understood storms, trade risks, disease, and the hazards of sea life. But the idea that the very ground beneath the streets might suddenly lose strength would have been difficult to imagine. The warning signs, even if present, belong to a language few could read. This makes the quiet tension of these final days especially striking. Above ground, the city remained vigorous and prosperous. Merchants worked among cargoes. Taverns and markets remained lively. Docks stayed busy. Yet beneath those ordinary scenes, forces were building. Strain deep within the earth continued to gather. The sandy foundation remained as vulnerable as ever. Minor disturbances may have been only faint expressions of much larger pressures not yet released. History often grants warning in forms too subtle to command attention. Port Royal may have known such warnings. Some accounts speak of tremors before the great earthquake, and whether frequent or isolated, even the suggestion of them carries weight. Small shakings can be easy to dismiss when they cause no immediate destruction. A brief trembling may pass, and life resume at once. People return to work. Ships continue loading. Markets remain open. Such resilience can be practical and necessary. Yet sometimes what appears an isolated disturbance belongs to a sequence still unfolding. This possibility gives these early tremors significance. They may have been faint preludes to a far greater movement. The ground beneath the city also held a vulnerability invisible in calm conditions. Saturated sand can appear stable until severe stress reveals otherwise. This hidden character of the land made warning difficult, because much of the danger was not something one could observe simply by walking the streets. It lay in how the ground might respond under circumstances not yet experienced. Hidden weakness often gives few dramatic signals. It waits until a threshold is crossed. In Port Royal, that threshold was drawing nearer. There is a quiet poignancy in imagining the city during this period. People moving through ordinary tasks, perhaps noticing little unusual beyond an occasional tremor or unexplained shift, while forces beneath them continue building. Nothing in the harbour's daily motion would have clearly foretold what was approaching. Ships still rode at anchor. Sunlight still crossed the water. Trade still flowed through docks and warehouses. Yet the conditions for catastrophe were gathering. Warning existed, but faintly. Soon those subtle signs would give way to violent certainty. What had been occasional tremors would become overwhelming shaking. What had been hidden instability beneath the sand would become visible ground failure. The city that had seemed secure in prosperity and routine was nearing the moment when Earth itself would begin to move with destructive force. The warnings, dim and uncertain, now give way to the earthquake itself. In the year 1692, the quiet warnings gave way to one of the most sudden urban disasters in history. A powerful earthquake struck Port Royal and the surrounding region, transforming ordinary life into catastrophe within moments. What had seemed a thriving city secure in trade and daily routine was confronted by violent ground motion no one in the streets could control or fully understand. The shaking began suddenly. Buildings trembled, walls cracked, streets shifted beneath those trying to keep their footing. What may have begun as confusion quickly became terror as the force of the earthquake grew. In a city built densely upon fragile sandy ground, severe shaking carried consequences far beyond the falling of isolated structures. It threatened the land itself beneath the city. Witnesses later described the earthquake as sudden and violent. The ground moved with enough force to damage buildings almost immediately. Masonry cracked. Structures leaned or collapsed. People in streets and homes struggled as stable ground seemed no longer stable. In ordinary earthquakes, destruction can come through falling buildings alone, but in Port Royal, something even more unusual was beginning. The sandy foundation beneath the city was responding to the shaking in ways far more dangerous than collapsing walls. The earthquake marked not simply structural damage, but the beginning of a deeper failure unfolding below the surface. For those experiencing the first moments, there may have been only confusion and instinct. Harbour workers at the docks, merchants in warehouses, families in homes, sailors in taverns or streets, all would have faced a world suddenly in violent motion. Familiar landmarks no longer offered reassurance. The city's dense layout, once a sign of prosperity, now meant damage could spread rapidly through crowded districts. Buildings standing close together increased hazard as walls failed and debris fell into narrow streets. What had been ordinary urban structure became part of the danger. The shaking itself was devastating, but its greatest significance lay in what it set into motion beneath the city. The loose water-filled sand supporting Port Royal began to lose strength under severe seismic stress. Though those in the city could not have understood the process in scientific terms, they would have experienced its effects with terrible clarity. Ground that should have remained firm began behaving unpredictably. Surfaces shifted. Stability disappeared. The earthquake was not only striking the city from below, it was changing the character of the ground on which the city stood. The harbour and waterfront likely became scenes of extraordinary disorder. Piers may have fractured. Ships at anchor may have responded to disturbed water. Along the shoreline, the boundary between land and sea itself may have seemed uncertain as shaking continued. In a port city so tied to maritime structures, earthquake damage would not have been confined inland. The entire urban system built along the harbour edge faced disruption at once. Roads, docks, warehouses, homes, and fortifications all stood within the same unfolding event. The speed of such disasters often makes them difficult to comprehend even while they occur. In ordinary life, change unfolds gradually. During a major earthquake, familiar order can break apart in moments. Port Royal likely experienced this collapse of ordinary expectation with brutal suddenness. People who began a routine day amid trade and harbour activity now faced a city in violent transformation. The confidence created by years of prosperity offered no protection against forces released from deep within the earth. All the wealth, trade, and structure of the city could not steady the shaking ground. The earthquake marked the beginning of widespread structural failure across Port Royal. Buildings already strained by dense construction and unstable foundations could not easily withstand severe motion. Some collapsed through shaking alone. Others were about to face a greater threat as the ground beneath them failed. The disaster was moving beyond earthquake damage towards something rarer and even more destructive. Port Royal was entering the event that would make it unlike almost any lost city in the world. There is something haunting in how quickly a thriving city can move from ordinary life into irreversible disaster. One moment the harbour is busy, streets active, warehouses full. Moments later, the earth itself is in upheaval. This suddenness is central to Port Royal's story. It was not slowly ruined through war or decline. It was transformed in minutes. The earthquake opened that transformation. Yet even amid violent shaking, the full scale of destruction had not yet arrived. What the earthquake began, the unstable ground beneath the city would magnify. The loose, saturated sands that had supported streets and buildings for years were beginning to behave in a way difficult to imagine for those living above them. Ground itself was losing the capacity to hold the city upright. The next stage of the disaster would not be merely collapse upon the land, but collapse of the land itself. As the shaking continued and buildings failed across the crowded port, Port Royal stood at the edge of a far stranger catastrophe than earthquake damage alone. The sandy ground below the city was about to lose solidity, and streets, buildings, and whole sections of the port would begin to sink as earth turned unstable beneath them. The great earthquake had struck. Now the ground itself would begin to move like liquid. As the earthquake shook Port Royal, the disaster moved into a far more unusual and devastating phase. The loose water-filled sand beneath the city began to lose the strength that had supported streets, buildings, and crowded districts for years. Under violent seismic shaking, the sandy ground no longer behaved as firm earth. It began to respond more like a fluid mass, a process now known as soil liquefaction. Though the people of Port Royal had no name for what was happening, they would have seen its effects in terrifying clarity. Ground that should have held steady began to fail beneath them. The city was not only being shaken, it was losing the support on which it stood. Liquefaction occurs when strong shaking disturbs saturated loose sediments so severely that the grains lose contact and the ground can no longer support weight in the ordinary way. In Port Royal, this process proved catastrophic because so much of the city stood upon precisely such material. Buildings that had survived the initial shaking now faced failure from below. Foundations sank or tilted as support vanished beneath them. Streets deformed. Surfaces split and shifted. What had seemed solid ground became unstable in ways almost impossible to comprehend in the moment. This was the hidden vulnerability of the sand revealing itself all at once. The city's dense construction made the effects even more severe. Heavy buildings resting on compromised ground could begin to sink under their own weight. Masonry structures might tilt as foundations settled unevenly. Walls could fail not only from shaking, but from the loss of stable support beneath them. Streets and structures that once formed a coherent cityscape began to break apart. In some areas, the land itself may have opened or subsided as saturated sands moved. What had been a thriving urban environment was becoming physically unmade from below. This process explains why Port Royal's destruction was so extraordinary. Many cities have suffered earthquake damage through collapsed buildings and fire. Port Royal faced something rarer. Whole sections of the city began sinking because the ground supporting them no longer behaved as ordinary ground. The disaster was not only above the surface, but within the land itself. This is what turned earthquake into submergence and made the city's fate unlike that of most urban catastrophes. For those living through it, the experience must have been bewildering as much as terrifying. Earthquake shaking alone is disorienting. To feel the ground itself soften or give way beneath one's feet would have seemed almost beyond understanding. Familiar streets could no longer be trusted. Buildings might tilt unexpectedly. Ground once taken for granted had become unstable in moments. In a crowded port city, this loss of footing and certainty would have added chaos to destruction already unfolding. The sandy foundation discussed from the beginning of this story now stood revealed as central to the city's fate. The very conditions that had allowed Port Royal to rise on the palisadoes now shaped its collapse. Loose coastal sediments, water-saturated ground, dense construction, and seismic force had converged. What had been hidden within the landscape from the city's founding was now acting openly. Geography, prosperity, and catastrophe had become one story. Some structures may have sunk while still partly intact, an extraordinary detail that later contributed to the preservation of the underwater city. Instead of being reduced only to rubble, parts of the city appear to have dropped into submerged conditions with remarkable suddenness. This helps explain why later archaeology found streets, buildings, and objects preserved in ways rarely seen elsewhere. The same process that destroyed Port Royal also helped preserve portions of it. Disaster and preservation began together in these moments. Liquefaction also helps explain why the destruction advanced so rapidly. Once ground loses its capacity to support weight, collapse can proceed with shocking speed. There may be little gradual warning. Failure can move from one area into another in cascading fashion. In a densely built city on fragile land, this can make catastrophe unfold in minutes rather than hours. Port Royal's famous suddenness belongs partly to this process. The city did not merely suffer damage over time, it sank with astonishing rapidity. There is something deeply striking in the thought that streets once full of trade and social life could in moments begin dropping toward the sea because sand grains beneath them no longer held together. Such events reveal how much human settlements depend on hidden geological stability, seldom noticed in ordinary life. Port Royal's prosperity had always rested upon conditions few considered. During liquefaction, those unseen foundations became the whole story. Yet even this phase was not the final stage. As ground failed and buildings sank, the sea itself began entering the disaster. Water rushed into collapsing areas. The boundary between harbour and city began to break apart. What had begun as earthquake and unstable ground was becoming submergence. Whole sections of Port Royal were nearing the moment when they would pass beneath the sea. Streets were sinking, structures were collapsing. The city was beginning to disappear underwater. As the ground beneath Port Royal lost strength and buildings began to sink, the disaster moved with astonishing speed. What had begun as violent shaking and unstable earth now became rapid urban collapse. Large sections of the city gave way within minutes, leaving little time for understanding, much less escape. This suddenness has always been one of the most remarkable features of Port Royal's destruction. Many cities decline through war, fire, or gradual abandonment. Port Royal was transformed almost at once. Entire neighborhoods began disappearing as the land beneath them subsided into the harbor. Streets that had been busy with trade and daily life moments before were vanishing from the surface. The speed of collapse came from the way failing ground could no longer support the dense city built upon it. Once saturated sand lost stability, buildings and streets could sink with startling rapidity. In some places, structures seemed to have dropped, while still partly intact, carried downward as the land itself subsided. This helps explain why later archaeological work found preserved sections of the city beneath the water. The collapse was not merely one of buildings crumbling into ruin. In places, it was the sinking of whole urban sections into a new underwater landscape. This gave the disaster a character unlike ordinary earthquake destruction. Imagine the shock of witnessing familiar streets disappear in moments, houses leaning and sinking, storehouses dropping toward the sea, ground splitting where firm streets had stood. In dense districts where buildings crowded close together, collapse in one area could quickly affect another. What had once been a tightly woven urban landscape was now breaking apart with devastating speed. The very density that supported the city's prosperity now intensified its vulnerability as destruction spread through connected structures and failing ground. Whole neighborhoods are thought to have been lost in this rapid collapse. This fact has given Port Royal much of its enduring fascination. It was not simply damaged by earthquake. Much of the city was physically transferred beneath the sea in a matter of minutes. Few urban disasters are remembered for such swift transformation. The bustling pirate port did not slowly become ruins. It became, almost instantly, a drowned city. For those trying to flee, the speed must have made escape terribly difficult. Catastrophe unfolding in minutes leaves little room for planning. People likely faced collapsing structures, unstable ground, and encroaching water all at once. Familiar routes through the city may have become impassable. Streets themselves could no longer be trusted. The ordinary geography of the city, so well known in daily life, was changing during the disaster itself. This may be among the most frightening elements of sudden collapse, when the very landscape used for orientation is transformed while one is still within it. The harbour too was becoming part of the destruction. As land subsided and sections of the city dropped, seawater entered collapsing areas. Boundaries between built city and surrounding water broke down. Areas once above sea level became part of the harbour floor. The sea was no longer beside the city. It was moving into it. This merging of urban collapse and marine submergence is central to what made Port Royal's destruction so extraordinary. Earthquake, failing ground, and seawater acted together. Some structures likely remained recognizable even as they sank. a detail that contributes to the image of a city frozen at the moment of loss. Streets, walls, rooms and objects could pass beneath water, not as scattered ruins alone, but as parts of a once living city suddenly submerged. This is part of why Port Royal later seemed less a vanished city erased than a city preserved in suspension beneath the harbour. The rapidity of collapse made such preservation possible. The event also altered the city's future in those same moments. A major commercial centre of the Caribbean was losing not merely buildings, but much of the very ground on which it stood. Prosperity, social life, trade networks, harbour routines, all were being interrupted through geological violence almost beyond precedent. A city that had seemed vigorous and permanent was being remade into something no one there could have imagined that morning. There is a strange stillness one can imagine following such violent speed. After moments of shaking, sinking, collapse and rushing water, whole districts that had held voices, commerce and movement may have fallen into sudden silence beneath the harbour. This contrast between bustling city and drowned stillness gives Port Royal much of its haunting historical power. In minutes, motion became submergence. Yet even amid this rapid collapse, the disaster was still unfolding. Seawater continued rushing into the sunken sections. Debris settled over newly submerged structures. The relationship between land and harbour was being permanently altered. What had begun as a thriving port on fragile sand was becoming an underwater city. The collapse had been swift. Now submergence would deepen as the sea claimed what the failing ground had surrendered. As large sections of Port Royal collapsed, the sea moved fully into the disaster. What had begun as violent shaking, then failing ground and sinking streets, now entered the phase of submergence. Seawater rushed into collapsing areas as land dropped below its former level, filling spaces where streets, buildings, and busy districts had stood only moments before. The boundary that had once clearly separated harbour from city was being erased. Water entered where solid ground had been. In these moments, Port Royal ceased to be only a city struck by earthquake. It was becoming a city beneath the sea. The rushing of seawater into sunken districts changed the disaster in a profound way. Collapse alone destroys structures, but submergence transforms landscape itself. Streets that had supported trade and daily life were no longer simply damaged. In some places they were passing into the harbour environment. Buildings that had tilted or sunk were now meeting invading seawater. This movement of the sea into the city made Port Royal's destruction unlike ordinary urban ruin. The harbour was no longer beside the city as a setting. It had become part of the event remaking the city. As submergence advanced, the boundary between land and sea changed with startling speed. Areas once above water became underwater terrain. What had been urban ground became part of a new submerged landscape. This shifting boundary is central to the meaning of Port Royal as a lost city. It was not abandoned to become ruins through centuries of decay. Portions of it crossed almost immediately from inhabited city into seabed. The change was abrupt, physical, and permanent. A living city was being translated into underwater archaeology. Some submerged sections began becoming part of the harbour floor itself. Streets, foundations, walls, and urban spaces entered a new setting where marine sediments would gradually cover and preserve them. This is one of the most extraordinary features of the event. Destruction and preservation unfolded together. As the city sank, parts of it were entering conditions that would help keep traces of 17th century life remarkably intact. The same waters claiming the city were also beginning to protect what had been lost. Debris from collapsing structures settled over sunken areas as the disaster continued. Broken masonry, timbers, household objects and sediments disturbed by collapse likely spread across newly submerged sections. Yet debris did not simply erase the city. In many places, it became part of the layers preserving it. Over time, sediments settling over structures would help shield remains beneath the harbour floor. What seemed at the moment only ruin would become part of why Port Royal survived in memory, not merely through written accounts, but through physical remains below water. The city was now partially underwater. This fact alone would have been difficult to imagine only moments before the earthquake began. A major port, busy with ships and commerce that very day, had lost significant sections to the sea. Some areas remained above water, damaged and unstable. Others had passed beneath the harbour. Port Royal existed suddenly in two conditions at once, partly surviving on land, partly drowned below the waterline. This division would shape everything that followed. There is something deeply striking in imagining the altered coastline after submergence began. Places once mapped as streets had become harbour floor. Familiar routes no longer existed as before. The relationship residents knew between city and sea had been permanently changed. Coastal geography itself had shifted during the disaster. Such transformations are rare in human history, which is one reason Port Royal remains so compelling. Few cities have had their boundary with the sea rewritten in a single event. The sea that had long sustained Port Royal through trade was now absorbing part of the city into its depths. This carries a strange historical symmetry. The harbour that brought prosperity became the waters preserving the drowned city. The marine setting that shaped Port Royal from its founding now shaped its afterlife beneath the sea. Geography was not merely the background to the story. It was part of every phase, from rise to destruction to preservation. As debris settled and submerged districts became part of the seabed, silence must have begun replacing the noise of commerce that had filled those streets. Places once crowded with labor and trade now lay under moving water. Fish would one day pass through spaces where merchants once worked. Sediments would gather over walls built for a thriving port. The transformation was astonishingly swift. A city alive with motion had become, in part, an underwater ruin. Yet the story did not end with submergence itself. Those who survived faced a shattered city above water, damaged, unstable, and altered beyond recognition. The earthquake, liquefaction, rapid collapse, and encroaching sea had changed Port Royal permanently, but human response now began. Survivors would relocate. The city's status would decline. The disaster's aftermath would shape what remained on land as profoundly as submergence shaped what rested below the harbour. From the drowned streets beneath the sea, the story now turns to what remained after the destruction. When the violent shaking ceased and the rushing water settled, those who remained in Port Royal faced a city profoundly changed. The disaster had not only destroyed buildings and submerged whole sections of the port, it had altered the city's future in ways that would never be reversed. What had been one of the most prosperous ports in the Caribbean was now damaged, unstable, and diminished. Streets once crowded with commerce were broken. Districts had vanished beneath the harbor. Surviving structures stood in a city transformed by catastrophe. The immediate aftermath was not a return to ordinary life, but an effort to comprehend what remained. For survivors, the city that emerged after the disaster was no longer the Port Royal they had known. Physical damage remained widespread. Buildings that had not sunk could still be cracked, weakened, or unsafe. Ground in some places remained uncertain. Harbor facilities essential to trade had suffered disruption. A city whose prosperity depended on tightly connected systems of movement had seen those systems fractured. Even where structures remained standing, the confidence that had once defined the port had been shaken. Stability itself had been called into question. Many survivors relocated to safer areas, a practical response in a city where large portions of land had failed and where continued risk may have seemed impossible to ignore. When settlements suffer catastrophic environmental change, people often move not simply because of damage already done, but because trust in the landscape has been broken. Port Royal's narrow, sandy foundation, once accepted without question, had revealed its danger. Relocation therefore reflected more than immediate necessity. It reflected a changed relationship between people and place. The city had become uncertain ground. The disaster also altered Port Royal's standing as a major center of trade. Prosperity built over years can be interrupted suddenly when infrastructure, population, and confidence all suffer severe shock. A harbor city depends upon reliability. Merchants, shipping networks, and political authorities all depend on functioning systems. Catastrophe can redirect those systems elsewhere. Port Royal's former prominence began to fade in the wake of the earthquake and submergence. Though life did not vanish entirely, the city lost much of the position it had once held in the Caribbean world. The port that had seemed ascendant entered decline. Recovery efforts in such circumstances were limited by the scale of destruction. Rebuilding after ordinary damage is difficult enough. Rebuilding after earthquake, sinking ground, and altered coastline presents deeper challenges. Some damage can be repaired. A transformed landscape is harder to restore. The disaster had not simply broken structures, it had removed parts of the city itself. This made full recovery improbable. Port Royal's story after the earthquake was not one of restoring a lost golden age, but of living with irreversible change. There is a profound difference between a city damaged and a city transformed. Port Royal belonged to the latter. Fire can be rebuilt after. Storm damage can sometimes be repaired. But where districts have become seabed and geography itself has changed, the settlement that survives is no longer the same city in any full sense. This helps explain why the earthquake of 1692 is remembered as the turning point in Port Royal's history. It did not merely wound the city, it altered its destiny. Yet even amid decline, memory of the lost city would have remained strong. Survivors had known the bustling port before destruction. They remembered streets now underwater, buildings now gone, routines interrupted forever. Such memory becomes part of a place's afterlife. Port Royal continued not only in what physically remained, but in recollection of what had been lost. That memory would later help preserve the city in historical imagination, long before underwater archaeology revealed physical traces below the harbor. The aftermath also began shaping how later generations interpreted the disaster. Some saw it through geology, though scientific understanding would come much later. Others framed it through moral or religious meaning, reflecting ideas of their own time. Yet beneath all such interpretations stood the stark physical reality. A wealthy port, built on fragile land, had suffered one of history's most dramatic natural catastrophes. That fact remained whether viewed through memory, legend, or later science. What is striking is that while Port Royal declined above water, another history was quietly beginning below it. In submerged districts, sediments were settling over streets and structures. Water covered what had once been bustling neighborhoods. Beneath the harbor, preservation had already begun. While survivors faced aftermath on land, the drowned city was entering a different kind of existence below the sea. This dual legacy makes Port Royal unique. One story unfolded through decline and memory above water. Another unfolded through preservation below it. As years passed, the damaged city that remained could never fully reclaim the status once held before the earthquake. Yet beneath the harbor rested something extraordinary, parts of a lost city protected by water and sediment, waiting unseen. The aftermath had closed one chapter in Port Royal's life, but it had opened another. What seemed only destruction would, in time, reveal one of the most remarkable preserved underwater cities in the world. The story now moves below the harbor, where the drowned sections of Port Royal lay sleeping in unexpected preservation. While Port Royal declined above water after the disaster, a different story was quietly unfolding below the harbor. The submerged sections of the city did not simply disappear into ruin. In many places they entered conditions that encouraged preservation. Streets, foundations, walls, and everyday objects that sank during the catastrophe came to rest beneath water and sediment, where change often proceeds differently than on land. This is one reason Port Royal holds such special importance. It is not remembered only as a city destroyed, but as a city unusually preserved. Beneath the harbor, parts of 17th century urban life remained where catastrophe left them. Submerged buildings in some areas stayed in recognizable positions beneath the water. Rather than being entirely scattered or erased, portions of the city survived as coherent remains on or below the harbor floor. This preservation is remarkable because disasters often destroy the very evidence through which they are later understood. In Port Royal, destruction helped create preservation. Rapid sinking, burial by sediments, and underwater conditions combined to protect parts of the lost city. Streets and structures that vanish from the surface did not vanish entirely from history. Sediment played a major role in this preservation. As disturbed material settled after the disaster, layers of sand and fine deposits covered portions of the submerged city. Over time, these layers acted as protection, helping shield structures and objects from some forms of decay. Burial can preserve by isolating remains from constant disturbance. In Port Royal, this process became one of the reasons the underwater city survived so well. What first appeared as debris settling after catastrophe became part of the long preservation of the site. Everyday objects left in place beneath the harbor make this preservation especially striking. In many archaeological sites, centuries of disturbance separate objects from their original settings. At Port Royal, some materials remained close to where they had been at the moment of destruction. This offers something rare, not simply artifacts from a lost city, but traces of daily life preserved in meaningful relationship to one another. Such preservation gives unusual insight into the city's final moments and the world that existed there before the earthquake. The underwater environment itself also slowed some forms of deterioration. Conditions below water can differ greatly from those on exposed land, where weather, erosion, and repeated rebuilding often alter or erase older remains. Beneath the harbour, submerged sections of Port Royal entered a quieter environment, shaped by sediments, water, and gradual natural processes. These conditions did not halt change entirely, but they helped preserve features that might otherwise have been lost. In this sense, the sea that claimed the city also became part of what protected it. This preservation has often led people to describe Port Royal as a city frozen in time. While no site remains literally untouched by time, the phrase captures something important. The earthquake and rapid submergence interrupted urban life so suddenly that portions of the city entered preservation at a particular historical moment. The result is an unusually vivid record of a 17th century port. This is what makes Port Royal not merely a dramatic disaster site, but one of the world's great archaeological landscapes. There is something deeply compelling in imagining quiet harbour waters moving above streets where merchants once walked, while below, remnants of that world remain preserved in darkness and sediment. Fish pass where cargo once moved. Marine life drifts through spaces once shaped by urban life. Yet beneath these natural rhythms, traces of the city endure. This meeting of lost human settlement and underwater environment gives Port Royal much of its enduring fascination. Preservation also changed the meaning of the disaster itself. What might have been remembered only through legend and scattered written accounts became something that could later be studied physically. The drowned city held evidence. Its submerged remains could speak through structures, objects, and urban layout. This transformed Port Royal from a story of catastrophe into a place where history could be recovered from below the sea. For generations, much of this underwater city remained unseen, resting beneath harbour sediments, while memory of the lost pirate port lived on above water. Yet the remains were there, waiting beneath quiet water. In time, curiosity, exploration, and archaeology would return attention to those submerged streets. What had been preserved through accident and geology would begin to be rediscovered through human study. The story therefore moves from preservation toward rediscovery. Beneath the harbour, Port Royal had endured in silence, but eventually divers and researchers would begin exploring what lay below the water, revealing how much of the lost city remained. From the sleeping underwater ruins, the story now turns to those first modern encounters with the drowned city beneath the sea. For many years, the submerged sections of Port Royal rested beneath the harbour in relative silence, known through historical accounts and local memory, yet largely hidden below water and sediment. The city survived in stories of sudden destruction and drowned streets, but much of what lay beneath the harbour remained unseen. That began to change when divers, historians, and later archaeologists turned sustained attention toward the underwater remains. What had long been spoken of as a lost city beneath the sea began gradually to emerge again through exploration. This rediscovery did not happen all at once, but through growing curiosity about what the harbour concealed and what the disaster had left behind. The idea that a 17th century city might survive underwater in meaningful form drew increasing interest. Port Royal began shifting from legend toward documented archaeological reality. Early exploration of submerged remains often begins with questions as much as answers. How much of the city survived below water? Where exactly had districts sunk? What remained in recognizable form? At Port Royal, such questions encouraged divers and researchers to investigate the harbour floor with increasing care. Beneath the water, they found evidence confirming that large parts of the lost city had indeed endured. Walls, foundations, street patterns, and artifacts began revealing that the historical accounts of sudden submergence were not exaggerations. The underwater city was real, and in some places remarkably preserved. This confirmation gave Port Royal growing importance not only as a famous lost place, but as a serious archaeological site. Rediscovery carries a special power because it joins present inquiry with vanished worlds. At Port Royal, divers entering the harbour were not simply exploring scattered shipwreck debris or isolated ruins. They were encountering parts of a drowned city. That distinction matters. A city holds streets, structures, spatial order, and traces of ordinary human life in ways different from many archaeological sites. Each submerged wall or preserved object helped reveal not just destruction, but the living city that existed before it sank. The rediscovery of Port Royal therefore became an act of recovering urban history from beneath the sea. Underwater surveys gradually helped map portions of the submerged city. Mapping projects are often among the most important stages of archaeological understanding, because they move beyond isolated discoveries towards seeing how remains relate as a whole. At Port Royal, this work helped identify drowned streets, building locations, and broader patterns beneath the harbour. The city began to take shape again, not as legend, but as a documented underwater landscape. What had once been imagined through written descriptions could increasingly be studied in spatial detail. This deepened understanding of both the disaster and the city itself. These discoveries also confirmed how unusual Port Royal was in global archaeology. Many ancient cities survive through buried remains on land. Far fewer survive as preserved underwater urban sites linked to a single sudden catastrophe. This gave Port Royal significance beyond Caribbean history. It became a place studied by archaeologists, historians, and geologists interested in urban life, disaster, and preservation. Rediscovery revealed not simply a local historical curiosity, but a site of world importance. Artifacts recovered or documented during exploration added another dimension to this process. Everyday objects can illuminate ordinary life in ways grand monuments alone cannot. Items tied to trade, household activity, work, and daily routine helped bring the lost city into clearer focus. They suggested not abstract history, but lived reality. Through such evidence, Port Royal became more than a dramatic story of sinking streets. It became a place where details of 17th century life could be examined with unusual immediacy. The underwater setting made this work challenging as well as fascinating. Archaeology below water requires methods different from excavation on land. Visibility, sediment movement, marine conditions, and preservation concerns all shape what can be studied. These challenges make the achievements of underwater investigation all the more remarkable. Recovering knowledge from submerged urban remains demands patience and precision. Port Royal rewarded such effort, because the site offered so much to learn. Rediscovery also confirmed something quietly suggested from the beginning of this story, that catastrophe had preserved a moment. The underwater remains did not simply show destruction. They preserved relationships between streets, structures, and objects that helped reconstruct the city at the instant its ordinary life ended. This gave Port Royal extraordinary interpretive value. Archaeologists were not only finding remnants, they were studying a city interrupted. There is something moving in the thought of divers descending through harbour water to encounter walls and streets belonging to a city lost for centuries. Above them, modern Jamaica continued its life. Below, rested traces of a 17th century port once called among the richest in the Caribbean. Such encounters make history feel less distant. Rediscovery does this. It shortens the space between past and present. As understanding grew, Port Royal became not merely a rediscovered lost city, but a place inviting deeper archaeological investigation. Mapping led to more detailed study. Discoveries raised new questions. What could the layout reveal about urban life? What objects remained undisturbed? What might the site teach about the final moments of the disaster? Rediscovery naturally led into fuller archaeological research. The more researchers studied the submerged city, the clearer it became that Port Royal offered insights far beyond the drama of its sinking. Its underwater remains preserved details of streets, structures, and daily life with rare richness. The site had moved from legend to rediscovery toward sustained archaeological understanding. What came next was closer examination of what these underwater remains could reveal. From rediscovery, the story now moves into the findings themselves, where drowned buildings and preserved objects begin speaking more fully about the lost city beneath the sea. As exploration of the submerged city deepened, Port Royal began revealing not only that it had survived beneath the harbour, but how much could be learned from what remained there. Archaeological findings brought the lost city into sharper focus through structures, artifacts, and preserved urban patterns that illuminated daily life at the moment disaster struck. This was one of the great strengths of the site. It did not offer isolated ruins alone, but interconnected evidence capable of showing how a thriving 17th century port functioned. Each discovery helped turn legend into documented history. Beneath the harbour floor, Port Royal began speaking through the material traces of ordinary urban life. Among the most remarkable findings were preserved structural remains. Walls, foundations, building outlines, and sections of streets allowed archaeologists to identify recognizable parts of the drowned city. Urban layout matters greatly in archaeology because it reveals not only what survived, but how a city was organized. At Port Royal, these submerged structures helped confirm the arrangement of districts and the physical reality of a city suddenly transferred below water. Streets that once carried merchants and sailors could still be traced. Buildings once part of a living port could still be recognized beneath sediment. Such survival is extraordinary in any archaeological setting. Artifacts recovered or documented at the site offered equally rich insight. Everyday objects often reveal aspects of life grand historical narratives overlook. Items linked to commerce, domestic routines, food, tools, and trade help show how people actually lived in Port Royal. Through such finds, the city emerges not merely as a dramatic pirate port, but as a human settlement of ordinary habits and practical routines. Archaeology often works this way, allowing small objects to restore texture to history. At Port Royal, those details carried special power because many had been preserved through sudden catastrophe. Some of the most valuable evidence came not simply from individual objects, but from how objects remained in relation to structures and spaces. Context is central in archaeology. A cup found in isolation tells one story. A cup found in relation to a room, a building, and a street tells much more. Because parts of Port Royal were preserved with unusual suddenness, such relationships sometimes survived in meaningful ways. This allowed researchers to study not only what people used, but where and how those things belonged in urban life. That is a rare advantage. Buildings preserved underwater also offered clues about the city's final moments. Tilting walls, collapsed features, and structural positions could help researchers interpret how sinking occurred and how rapidly certain areas failed. In this way, archaeology contributed not only to social history, but to understanding the disaster itself. The drowned city held evidence of destruction as well as everyday life. Few sites offer both with such intimacy. These findings also confirm that Port Royal was far more than a romantic pirate legend. The archaeology revealed a serious urban center of trade, infrastructure, and daily routines. This is an important correction because popular imagination often narrows Port Royal to tales of privateers and treasure. The submerged remains show a fuller reality, a working city with complexity, commerce, and ordinary life. Archaeology often restores nuance where legend simplifies, and Port Royal offers a powerful example. The site also provided rare information about 17th century material culture in the Caribbean world. Trade goods, tools, building remains, and everyday objects helped illuminate patterns of life tied to maritime commerce and colonial urban existence. Because Port Royal stood at the meeting of many trade routes, its remains could reflect connections stretching far beyond Jamaica. In this way, the site contributes not only to local history, but to understanding a wider Atlantic world linked through ships, goods, and movement. There is something remarkable in how catastrophe preserved this knowledge. The earthquake and sinking that destroyed the city also protected evidence historians might otherwise never have possessed. Streets buried by sediment became archives. Drowned rooms became records. The harbour floor became a historical document written in structures and objects rather than words. This is part of what makes Port Royal so singular. Destruction became preservation, and preservation became knowledge. The archaeological findings also carried emotional force. To encounter remains of a city interrupted in moments is different from studying ruins shaped through centuries of gradual change. There is often a sense of immediacy in such sites, a closeness to the ordinary lives once lived there. Port Royal holds that quality. The findings do not simply describe a lost city. They make it feel present in fragments, still legible beneath the water. As discoveries accumulated, Port Royal's importance continued growing among researchers. The site offered urban archaeology, disaster archaeology, maritime history, and geological evidence in one place. Few sites bring together so many fields of study so naturally. This breadth of significance helped move Port Royal beyond fascination into sustained scientific and historical importance. Yet the findings did more than reveal a lost city. They also helped scientists better understand the forces that destroyed it. The same evidence illuminating daily life and urban structure contributed to study of earthquakes, unstable ground, and catastrophic landscape change. From archaeology, the story now widens towards science itself, where Port Royal became not only a preserved city of history, but a case study that helped explain how such disasters happen. As archaeologists uncovered more of the drowned city, Port Royal began offering insights that reached beyond history into the study of natural forces themselves. The site was not only a preserved urban landscape, but also a rare geological case through which scientists could better understand how earthquakes interact with unstable ground. What had destroyed Port Royal became part of scientific knowledge. The same event that ended a thriving port helped reveal principles later used to understand hazards in many other parts of the world. In this way, the city's legacy widened from maritime history into earth science. One of the central scientific lessons drawn from Port Royal concerned the role of saturated sandy ground during earthquakes. Researchers studying the disaster recognized that soil liquefaction was the primary cause of the city's extraordinary collapse. The earthquake alone caused severe damage, but the widespread sinking of streets and buildings resulted because the loose water-filled sands beneath the city lost strength under violent shaking. This understanding became crucial. It showed that earthquake damage can depend not only on the strength of shaking, but on the kind of ground beneath a settlement. Two cities may experience the same earthquake and suffer very different outcomes depending on geology. Port Royal became one of history's clearest examples of that truth. This scientific understanding transformed the disaster from historical tragedy into an important case study. Geologists could examine how unstable coastal sediments behave under seismic stress. Engineers and hazard researchers could study why certain foundations become vulnerable during earthquakes. Port Royal demonstrated in dramatic fashion that the composition of the ground beneath buildings matters as much as the buildings themselves. Today, this principle is fundamental in seismic risk assessment, but sites like Port Royal helped establish that knowledge through real historical evidence. The city also offered a powerful example of how natural systems often interact rather than act in isolation. The destruction did not result from one cause alone. Tectonic movement triggered earthquake shaking. Shaking destabilized saturated sand. Ground failure caused rapid collapse. Seawater entered collapsing areas and contributed to submergence. This chain of interacting processes made the event so devastating. Scientific study of Port Royal helped illuminate how disasters often emerge through such linked systems rather than a single isolated force. That insight reaches far beyond one city. Researchers also use Port Royal to help explain similar hazards elsewhere. Once the processes behind its destruction were better understood, the city became a reference point when studying other regions built on loose sediments vulnerable to liquefaction. Though each earthquake differs, certain principles can apply widely. Port Royal thus contributed to broader understanding of coastal urban risk. A city lost in the 17th century became relevant to modern questions of hazard and resilience. There is something remarkable in this shift from catastrophe to knowledge. What residents experienced as bewildering destruction became, centuries later, part of the scientific understanding that may help reduce risk in other places. This does not undo the tragedy, but it gives the event a wider legacy. Port Royal did not vanish only into memory. It contributed to human understanding of the Earth itself. Scientific study also deepened appreciation of how unusual the city's preservation was. The same geological processes that destroyed the city helped create conditions for underwater conservation. Science therefore helped explain not only collapse, but preservation. Once again, destruction and survival proved linked. The site revealed how geology shaped both. Port Royal's importance in scientific understanding also reminds us that natural disasters often expose hidden realities present long before catastrophe. The loose, saturated sands beneath the city had always been there. Their vulnerability existed from the city's founding, though unnoticed in ordinary life. The earthquake did not create that vulnerability, it revealed it. This distinction matters in hazard science and in history alike. Often disaster exposes conditions already woven into a landscape. The site also illustrates a broader lesson about human settlements. Cities are often shaped by environments that provide opportunity while carrying risk. Harbors support trade, river valleys support agriculture, coasts support exchange. Yet the same environments can hold flood risk, seismic risk, storm risk, or unstable ground. Port Royal embodies this tension with unusual clarity. Its prosperity depended on geography. Its destruction also emerged from geography. Science helps make that dual truth visible. There is a quiet elegance in how the story comes full circle here. Early in this narrative, the sandy spit beneath Port Royal seemed almost a background detail. Through science, it becomes central, the key to understanding why the city rose where it did, and why it sank as it did. Geography, history, archaeology, and geology all converge. As researchers continued studying Port Royal, it became clear the site held significance not only as a scientific case study, but as a place of global historical importance. It was not merely an example used in geology, but one of the world's great preserved underwater cities, drawing attention from far beyond Jamaica. From scientific understanding, the story now widens again, toward the global significance of Port Royal as a site studied and valued across the world. By the time archaeologists and scientists had studied both the submerged remains and the geological story of its destruction, Port Royal had come to be understood as far more than a famous lost pirate city. It emerged as one of the most important preserved underwater cities in the world. This significance rests not simply on the drama of its sinking, but on the rare combination of urban preservation, historical richness, and scientific value held in one place. Few sites offer a drowned city, preserved traces of daily life, evidence of sudden catastrophe, and geological lessons of lasting relevance. Port Royal does all of these. That is why its importance extends far beyond Jamaica and the Caribbean. Among underwater archaeological sites, Port Royal holds a special place because it preserves an urban world rather than a single shipwreck or isolated ruin. Many famous underwater sites center on vessels lost at sea. Port Royal is different. It preserves portions of a city, with streets, structures, and the material traces of urban life. This makes it exceptional. Cities reveal patterns of commerce, social life, architecture, and daily routine in ways individual wrecks cannot. Port Royal therefore offers a scale and richness unusual in underwater archaeology. It is often regarded as one of the great submerged cities of the world for precisely this reason. Its significance also lies in how it joins human history with natural disaster. Some archaeological sites illuminate ancient societies. Some geological sites illuminate natural forces. Port Royal does both at once. It preserves evidence of a thriving 17th century port, while also recording one of history's most dramatic earthquake-related catastrophes. Through that union, it offers insight not only into urban life, but into how environmental forces can transform human settlements. This combination gives the site unusual depth. It is at once a city of history and a landscape of geological memory. Researchers from several fields have been drawn to Port Royal because of this breadth. Archaeologists study the submerged city and its preserved remains. Historians examine trade, piracy, and colonial life linked to the port. Geologists study the earthquake and liquefaction processes revealed there. Maritime scholars consider the city's role in Caribbean networks. Few places invite so many disciplines into conversation so naturally. Port Royal has become a meeting point of inquiry, where multiple kinds of knowledge intersect. This wide interest has helped bring global attention to the site. People are drawn to Port Royal for many reasons. Some are fascinated by the pirate legends, others by the underwater ruins, others by the scientific lessons of the disaster. Such varied interest has made the city known far beyond academic circles. It holds a place in historical imagination as well as scholarship. That broader fascination is part of its significance too. Some places matter because they preserve evidence, others because they stir enduring curiosity. Port Royal does both. Its global importance also comes from how well it illustrates the vulnerability of even prosperous and powerful places. History often remembers lost cities, swallowed by desert sands, or buried beneath volcanic ash. Port Royal belongs among those great examples of sudden transformation. Yet unlike many legendary lost places, much of Port Royal can be studied directly through preserved remains. It is both symbol and evidence. That gives it unusual power as a historical site. There is something striking in how a city once known for commerce and maritime risk became centuries later a place through which people study resilience, hazard, preservation, and memory. Port Royal's significance has not remained fixed. It has grown as new questions have been asked of the site. This is often how important historical places endure. Their meanings deepen over time. Port Royal has moved from colonial port to lost city to archaeological treasure to global case study. Its continuing importance also rests in what remains to be learned. Significant sites do not lose value once first studied. They continue offering questions. What more may submerged districts reveal? What further insights into 17th century urban life may emerge? What can the site still teach about disasters and preservation? Port Royal remains important not only because of what has been discovered, but because inquiry continues. There is quiet wonder in the thought that beneath Caribbean waters rests a city whose streets once carried merchants, sailors, laborers, and privateers, now studied by people from around the world seeking to understand history and the earth itself. That arc from thriving port to drowned city to global historical site gives Port Royal a rare place in human memory. Few cities have traveled such a path. For all the scientific importance and global interest, however, Port Royal also remains something simpler and perhaps deeper, a reminder of how swiftly human worlds can change and how traces of those worlds can endure. That is why the site continues to resonate. It speaks at once of prosperity, fragility, loss, and preservation. Those themes reach beyond one city. As one of the world's great underwater cities, Port Royal now stands not only as a subject of study, but as a lasting historical symbol. Its global significance rests in all these layers together. Yet beyond significance lies reflection. Beyond study lies what the city's story means. From world importance, the story now turns toward its final legacy, and what Port Royal still suggests as it rests beneath the sea. Port Royal's story begins as the story of a prosperous harbour city, yet it ends as something broader, a reflection on how human settlements rise through opportunity while always resting within larger natural forces. Few places show this more clearly. A city built through trade, maritime ambition, and remarkable geographic advantage flourished on a narrow strip of sand beside warm Caribbean waters. Wealth gathered there. Ships crowded its harbour. Streets filled with commerce and daily life. It seemed vigorous, important, and enduring. Yet in a matter of minutes, the same landscape that helped create that prosperity became part of its destruction. Port Royal remains a powerful reminder that even thriving cities exist within forces far older and larger than themselves. Its story also reveals how quickly change can come. Much of human life is built upon assumptions of continuity. Streets remain where they are. Ground remains solid. Harbours continue receiving ships. Tomorrow resembles today. Port Royal reminds us such continuity, though often reliable, is never absolute. Natural forces can alter landscapes suddenly and permanently. The city's destruction reflects that truth with unusual clarity. A major centre of trade became partly seabed in a single event. Few stories show the vulnerability of human settlements so vividly. Yet Port Royal is not remembered only for vulnerability. It is remembered because loss there gave rise to preservation. The city did not simply vanish. It remained in memory, in submerged streets, in objects resting beneath harbour sediments, and in the knowledge later drawn from its ruins. This gives its story an unusual character. Destruction did not erase meaning, it deepened it. What sank beneath the sea became one of the most remarkable records of a lost urban world. There is also a larger reflection in the relationship between prosperity and fragility. Port Royal rose because of geography, the harbour, the sand spit, the sea routes, the very environmental setting that later shaped catastrophe. Opportunity and vulnerability were never separate. They existed together from the beginning. This may be one of the deepest lessons the city offers. Places of great promise often carry hidden risks intertwined with their advantages. Port Royal simply makes that truth visible in dramatic form. The city also connects history with scientific understanding in a rare way. Through its ruins, we see urban life in the 17th century. Through its destruction, we understand something about earthquakes and unstable ground. Through its preservation, we see how catastrophe can unexpectedly protect the past. Few places join these dimensions so naturally. Port Royal stands where human history and Earth history meet. There is quiet wonder, too, in imagining the city as it rests today. Beneath clear Caribbean waters lie streets where merchants once walked, walls shaped by hands centuries ago, and traces of daily life interrupted in moments. Fish move through spaces once filled with commerce. Sediments cover the remains of taverns, homes, and storehouses. The harbour still lives above the city that sleeps below it. This image has drawn people for generations because it feels both historical and timeless. A drowned city beneath calm water carries a kind of stillness that invites reflection. Port Royal also endures because it preserves a human scale within grand history. Behind earthquakes and lost cities stand ordinary lives. Sailors at the docks, workers moving cargo, families in narrow streets, merchants counting goods. The city was made of people living ordinary days before extraordinary disaster arrived. Remembering this keeps the story grounded. Port Royal was not legend first, it was a living city. Its legacy now extends far beyond the harbour where it once flourished. It survives in archaeology, in science, in historical imagination, and in the wider human fascination with lost places. Yet perhaps its deepest legacy lies in what it asks us to notice: the hidden foundations beneath visible success, the closeness of beauty and fragility, the persistence of the past beneath seeming disappearance. These are quiet lessons, fitting for a city now resting beneath the sea. And so the story returns to stillness. The harbour that once held crowded ships now moves gently above submerged streets. Sunlight passes through blue water over stones that once formed a thriving port. Time has carried away the noise of trade, yet the city remains, not as it was, but as a preserved moment in the long history of people and the sea. Port Royal was destroyed by natural forces, preserved by those same forces, and remembered because both truths endure together. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you enjoyed learning about the sunken pirate city of Port Royal.